In the previous lectures for this chapter, you have learned about the four different types of tissues. So remember, there is epithelial tissue, there is connective tissue, the most diverse different type of tissue, there is muscle, and there is also nervous tissue. So you need to know the different examples of where you find these in the body, as well as the functions of each of the different ones. So the rest of this chapter is on the covering and lining membranes, as well as tissue repair. Now, the different types of covering and lining of tissues are going to be made up of these two major types of tissues. So remember from chapter 1, when we classify structural organization, if we have two or more different types of tissues, it's considered to be an organ. So technically, these membranes are types of organs, and the ones that we're going to focus on are cutaneous, mucous, and also serous membranes. In chapter 8, we're going to talk about synovial membranes, so we're not going to address that here. This first slide is showing the three major types of tissues. There is the cutaneous membrane, which is made up of keratinized, stratified, squamous. So keratinized, stratified, squamous, remember, means that it's many layers thick, and keratin is a tough fibrous protein that is going to give the epidermis, which is the cutaneous membrane, the characteristic of being very, very strong and for protection. So the epidermis, again, is the cutaneous membrane. Then we have the mucous membranes, and the mucous membranes, or mucosa, which we can also refer to them as the mucosa. In this example, these are wet membranes, and so they're going to be producing a moist substance. They're going to be present in body cavities that are open to the outside of the body, such as hollow organs of the GI tract, the esophagus, for example, as we see here, the respiratory system, and also the urogenital tract. And in this case, these are either going to be stratified squamous, so they could be many, many layers, and we're going to find these many layers specifically in areas closest to the opening of the body. So the mucosa of the nasal cavity or the oral cavity would be stratified squamous epithelium, as well as the esophagus. Now, in the GI tract, though, we have simple columnar epithelium, and the two main functions that we have for the mucous membranes are going to be both absorption and also secretion. The third type of membrane is the serous membranes, or commonly called the serosa. And these are going to be simple squamous epithelium that have areolar connective tissue deep to them. The result is that these membranes are going to be producing a fluid. It's a clear fluid called serous fluid. So serous fluid is produced, and this serous fluid is going to be found actually between these membranes. So it'll be located between the parietal and the visceral layer. And the function of this serous fluid is to help to prevent friction for that particular organ. So for the lungs, as we see here, again, parietal means superficial, visceral means it's actually touching the organ, and the pericardium, of course, refers to the heart. The peritoneum then are going to refer to the belly or abdomen area, so the GI tract areas where we would find the peritoneum. The last slide of this mini lecture is on the three stages of tissue repair, and you just need to know the general stages and events that happen in this situation. The first event is that inflammation will occur when there is damage. So the inflammation stage occurs when there is some bleeding that occurs. The bleeding is going to trigger the release of various chemicals that come into the area, things like macrophages or mast cells, other inflammatory chemicals, and they end up entering this area because the blood vessels are more permeable. Other proteins can seep into this particular area, and clotting is going to begin. The inflammation stage ends with the forming of a scab. The next phase is organization, which is going to be sort of the organization of the beginning of the connective tissue. So the fibroblasts are going to produce collagen fibers that sort of fill in or bridge the gap here. There's going to be macrophages that clean up cell debris, and surface epithelial cells that multiply and migrate. Then the third step would be the regeneration and the permanent repair. During this case, the epithelium is going to thicken, and we're going to see a return to the tissue that we had before the initial injury. So there's a few points I want to make here before you start studying for your first exam, your Unit 1 exam, which you will be taking coming up this weekend. First of all, the later parts of the chapters 1 through 4, where it talks about the developmental aspects, you are not responsible for. So you don't need to study that part. So you can ignore it, as well as any section that is labeled closer look. I would encourage you to use as your study guides the chapter summary. The chapter summary in this textbook is really, really useful, and it tends to kind of summarize many of the things that I have gone over in the lectures. So it starts out with chapter summary. It tells you where you can find some other resources in mastering A&P, and then it ends with some review questions. And these review questions I would encourage you to do. The answers to them should be in the back of your textbook. You don't need to do the critical thinking clinical application questions. You can, but the test is going to be all multiple choice and all matching. The other part that you can ignore besides the developmental aspects and the closer look would be the at the clinic terms. You're not going to be tested on those. So with any other questions that you may have, please let me know before you take your test this weekend, and best of luck on the test.